Picture this. You are crouching behind a bush. It is pitch dark. You can hear something breathing nearby. Something big. Something that has not eaten today. Your best friend is standing 10 feet away, completely oblivious, picking berries like life is beautiful. You need to warn him, right now. You open your mouth and nothing. Not because you are scared, not because your throat is dry, but because the part of your brain that turns thought into words simply does not exist yet. The software has not been installed. You are a fully grown human being with a big brain and complex emotions and genuine opinions about which berries taste better, and you cannot say a single word to save your friend's life. That was real. That actually happened. For a long stretch of human history, we were walking around this planet completely mute, unable to communicate anything more sophisticated than a grunt and a pointed finger. And somehow, from that silence, we built languages. 7,000 of them. We went from biological mutes to the species that invented poetry, courtroom arguments, therapy, and the phrase, "we need to talk," which somehow feels more threatening than anything a predator could ever do. How? How did we get from nothing to everything? That is what we are going to figure out today. And I promise you, the answer is stranger and more fascinating than anything you are expecting. Let's start with the most inconvenient fact about this entire topic. Language is invisible. You cannot dig it up. You cannot carbon date a conversation. You cannot find a fossil and see a sentence carved into it. Language is made of air, and air does not exactly stick around for 100,000 years waiting to be analyzed. So every scientist studying the origin of speech is essentially a detective working a cold case with almost no physical evidence, piecing together fragments and making educated guesses. The good news is that some of those educated guesses are absolutely extraordinary. But before we talk about when language appeared, we need to settle something more fundamental. What even is language? Because this is where most people get it wrong. Animals communicate. That is not a controversial statement. Bees do a little waggle dance to tell their hive exactly where the best flowers are, complete with distance and direction. Dolphins have individual signature whistles that function as names. Chimpanzees use a system of calls and gestures that conveys real, useful information about the world around them. So animals were not sitting in silence, waiting for humans to invent communication. Communication is ancient. What humans did was something categorically different. We crossed a line that no other species has fully crossed. We went from signals to symbols. Here is the difference, and it is everything. A signal is direct. A dog growls because something is threatening it. The growl and the threat are the same thing. You cannot separate them. But a symbol is abstract. The word danger has absolutely nothing to do with danger. It does not sound dangerous. It does not look like danger. It is just a collection of sounds that a bunch of humans agreed, at some point, would represent that specific concept. Every word you have ever spoken in your entire life is a social hallucination. A collective agreement between minds about what a particular vibration in the air is supposed to mean. When you actually stop and think about that, it is one of the most insane things in the universe. And making that leap from direct signal to abstract symbol was the single most important cognitive event in the history of our species. Now here is where scientists start throwing things at each other, because nobody agrees on when exactly this happened. There are two camps, and they have been arguing for decades. Camp 1 believes language evolved slowly and gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, getting more and more complex, like a city that keeps adding new buildings. They point to our primate relatives, chimps and bonobos and gorillas, who already show early signs of symbolic thinking. They can learn sign language. They can combine symbols in new ways. They understand that objects have names. So maybe language is just the far end of a very long road that started millions of years ago with our common ancestors. Camp 2 thinks that is completely wrong. They believe something clicked. Somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, some mutation or some critical threshold of brain complexity suddenly unlocked the full system. Specifically, the ability to do something called recursive syntax, embedding ideas inside other ideas inside other ideas. The man who I think knows the woman who lost the dog, who bit the child who lives near the river. That kind of brain-twisting complexity. And before that moment, according to this camp, there was nothing even close. Language did not grow. It erupted. The truth, as it usually does, probably lives somewhere in the middle. Multiple pieces came together at different times, and at some point they hit a critical mass and everything changed. Let us talk about those pieces. The first piece is physical, because language is not just a mental activity. It is a full body sport. To produce the enormous range of sounds that make up human speech, you need very specific anatomy that most of our evolutionary relatives simply do not have. The key player is the larynx, your voice box, and specifically where it sits in your throat. In almost every other mammal, including chimpanzees, the larynx sits high in the throat. This is actually a useful design. It means they can breathe and swallow simultaneously without choking. Efficient. Practical. Safe. In humans, the larynx dropped way down. This created a larger resonating chamber that allows us to produce the full range of vowels and consonants that make complex speech possible. The downside is brutal. We can choke. We are, in fact, the only mammals on Earth that regularly die from inhaling food. Every single year, thousands of humans choke to death on things like poorly chewed steak or, and this is real, ambitious sandwiches. Evolution essentially looked at the gift of language and said yes, absolutely worth the risk of dying to a rogue piece of bread. No notes. The descent of the larynx happened gradually over millions of years. But here is the frustrating part. Larynx position does not fossilize. Soft tissue disappears. So how do we know anything about the vocal anatomy of ancient humans? One bone. The hyoid. The hyoid is a small U-shaped bone in your throat that anchors the muscles involved in speaking and swallowing. It is the only bone in the entire human body that does not connect to any other bone. It just floats there, suspended by muscles and tendons, doing its quiet, important work. And because of its relationship to the muscles of speech, its shape can give us clues about how ancient hominids might have sounded. In 1989, archaeologists found a complete hyoid bone at a Neanderthal burial site in Israel. It was 60,000 years old. When scientists analyzed its shape, they found something that genuinely stopped the room. It was nearly identical to a modern human hyoid, which suggested that Neanderthals, our stocky, thick-browed cousins who lived across Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, may have had the physical capacity for speech. Let that sit for a moment. Neanderthals, potentially talking, potentially complaining about the weather and arguing about the best route to the river and gossiping about who stole whose flint tools. And then genetics entered the picture and things got truly wild. In 2002, scientists identified a gene called FOXP2. The press immediately nicknamed it the language gene, which made every actual geneticist quietly lose their mind because it is a massive oversimplification. But the nickname stuck because the underlying discovery is genuinely remarkable. Humans with damaged copies of FOXP2 have severe, debilitating difficulties with speech and language. They struggle to coordinate the fine motor movements needed for speaking. They have serious trouble with grammar. The gene clearly matters enormously for language. And here is what made the scientific world erupt. The human version of FOXP2 is different from every other mammal on Earth, including chimpanzees. Mice have FOXP2. Songbirds have FOXP2. Even crocodiles have FOXP2. But humans have two specific mutations in this gene that appear nowhere else in the animal kingdom. Mutations that show every sign of having been aggressively selected for by evolution. Evolution really wanted us to have these mutations. Researchers then tested Neanderthal DNA extracted from ancient bones. And when they looked at FOXP2, the Neanderthals had the same mutations. The exact same ones. Which means either both modern humans and Neanderthals inherited this adaptation from a common ancestor at least 400,000 years ago, or it evolved independently in both species. The second option would be such a staggering coincidence that most scientists simply refuse to believe it. So by at least 400,000 years ago, our ancestors had the genetic wiring for the physical coordination that speech requires. The hardware was installed. Now we needed the software. Here is the part that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important piece of the entire puzzle. You can have a perfectly positioned larynx. You can have the FOXP2 gene. You can have every piece of vocal anatomy wired up and ready. And it means absolutely nothing without one specific cognitive ability. Theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to understand that other people have thoughts, beliefs, intentions, and knowledge that are different from your own. It is the ability to model another mind from the inside. And real language, not just signaling, requires it completely and totally. Think about what happens when you say a word to another person. You are not just making a noise. You are making a noise with the specific intention that the other person will recognize your intention to communicate a specific meaning. And you are trusting that they will understand that you mean to be understood. Language is social telepathy. It is two minds reaching across space and darkness and individuality and touching. And that requires each mind to believe, deeply and automatically, that the other mind is real, is active, and is trying to understand. Non-human animals appear to largely lack this or have it in dramatically more limited form. A chimpanzee communicates to get something or to respond to something immediate in its environment. It is not trying to share information for the pure cooperative pleasure of sharing information. It is not telling you about something interesting it saw yesterday just because it thought you might find it interesting. That collaborative, generous, fundamentally social impulse to share knowledge, that appears to be uniquely, radically human. And fascinatingly, the development of this social cognition seems to track directly with something else that was happening in our evolutionary history. Our groups were getting bigger. 500,000 years ago, our ancestors lived in small, tight bands. By 100,000 years ago, groups were expanding and becoming dramatically more complex. And managing relationships in larger groups requires something exponentially more demanding. You need to keep track of who likes whom, who betrayed whom, who owes what to whom, whose alliance with whom means you need to be careful around whom. It is essentially a full-time cognitive job just to navigate the social landscape. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar made a famous argument that language evolved precisely as a solution to this social complexity problem. He called it social grooming by another means. Chimpanzees maintain their social bonds by physically picking insects off each other, which is genuinely sweet. But it does not scale well when your tribe has 150 people in it. You cannot groom everyone. You do not have enough hands or enough hours. Language lets you bond with multiple people at once. You can maintain 5 relationships simultaneously while sitting around a fire just talking. And the killer app, the feature that drove language adoption faster than anything else? Gossip. Exchanging social information. Who did what? Who can be trusted? Who is sleeping with whose partner? Who lied about where they were last Tuesday? Gossip is not shallow or trivial. In the context of human evolutionary history, gossip was survival intelligence, and language made it infinitely more efficient than anything that came before. Once language existed, the feedback loops became extraordinary. Language enabled better coordination. Better coordination enabled bigger and more complex societies. Bigger societies created more information that needed to be transmitted. More information put pressure on language to become more precise and more powerful. More precise language allowed knowledge to be transmitted across generations. Not just demonstrated in real time, but explained, narrated, embedded in stories that could travel across decades and centuries. And once knowledge could accumulate rather than being reinvented from scratch every generation, cultural evolution began moving at a pace that biological evolution simply could not match. The game changed permanently. Now, what were the actual first words? This is where linguistics gets wonderfully, gloriously ridiculous. The oldest theory is called the bow wow theory. The idea is that first words were imitations of environmental sounds. You see a dog, you name it after the noise it makes. You hear thunder, you call it something that sounds like thunder. This is real. Words like crash, buzz, hiss, and sizzle clearly come from the sounds they describe. But you cannot onomatopoeia your way to words like justice or bureaucracy or nevertheless. At some point, you need arbitrary symbols, and bow wow cannot explain that jump. Then there is the poo-poo theory. That is its actual academic name. This theory suggests language grew from involuntary emotional sounds. The ouch when you stub your toe, the gasp of surprise, the laugh, the sigh. These are ancient and real, but they are largely instinctive and uncontrolled, which makes it very hard to see how they evolved into deliberate, structured grammar. There is the yo-he-ho theory, which proposes that rhythmic grunts during coordinated physical labor, hauling heavy logs, rowing together, pulling ropes, gave rise to the rhythmic patterns underlying speech. Think sea shanties as a living fossil of proto-language. There is actually something real here. Music and language share enormous overlaps in the brain, and many researchers believe they co-evolved, which would mean humans were singing before they were speaking, which is either beautiful or deeply strange depending on your perspective. And then there is the gesture hypothesis, which is taken very seriously by serious people. The basic idea is that language may have roots in hand and body movement, and the voice developed to mirror and eventually replace physical gesture. And the evidence is surprisingly strong. The area of the brain responsible for language in modern humans is closely linked to areas that control fine motor movements of the hands. In non-human primates, this same region processes manual gestures and facial expressions. The connection is not accidental. Infants learn to point before they learn to speak. Pointing, directing another person's attention to a specific thing, may be the most fundamental linguistic act there is, and it starts in the hands. By around 70,000 years ago, something dramatic happened. Modern humans suddenly began behaving in ways that looked completely different from anything that came before. Complex art, personal jewelry, sophisticated tools, long-distance trade networks, symbolic objects with no obvious survival function. Archaeologists call this the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, and it happened fast, in evolutionary terms, almost overnight. This explosion of behavior is, in many ways, simply what language looks like from the outside. The cave paintings at Chauvet, 36,000 years old, depicting animals with movement and depth and implied narrative. Those are the work of minds that had stories. The carefully carved bone flutes, the Venus figurines, the shells worn as jewelry. All of these are products of a species that had learned to take things that existed only in the mind and make them exist in the physical world. That is what language does at its deepest level. It externalizes thought. It makes the invisible visible, the temporary permanent, the individual collective. Here is the thing that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. Every language on Earth today, all 7,000 of them, from Mandarin to Swahili to Basque to the extraordinary click languages of the Kalahari Desert. Every single one of them, despite their remarkable surface differences, shares deep structural properties that linguists believe are hardwired into the human brain itself. Noam Chomsky called this universal grammar, the idea that all human languages are fundamentally the same language wearing different cultural clothes, because they all emerge from the same underlying cognitive architecture that evolution built into us. And here is the proof. Babies across every culture, every language, every circumstance, acquire language the same way, at the same pace, through the same stages. A baby in Tokyo, and a baby in Lagos, and a baby in Sao Paulo will all babble, then produce single words, then two-word combinations, then full sentences, on roughly the same timeline, without anyone explicitly teaching them the rules of grammar. The capacity is installed at birth. Evolution put it there. That capacity, that world-altering, species-defining, everything-changing capacity came from millions of years of accidents and adaptations. A larynx that slowly dropped into a dangerous position. A gene that mutated in exactly the right way. A brain that wired itself for social complexity because the social world kept getting more complicated. A species that needed to keep track of who owed what to whom around increasingly crowded and complicated campfires. All of that. Millions of years of pressure and mutation and selection and lucky accidents. All of it building toward one moment. Somewhere in Africa, in the dark, two human beings looked at each other, and one of them said something, and the other one understood. Not a grunt, not a signal, a word, a symbol. A piece of one mind handed across the dark to another mind and received intact. That was the moment everything started. Not poetry, not philosophy, not love songs, though those came quickly enough. Just two people sharing one piece of information that mattered. Two minds touching across the darkness, which is still, every single time you open your mouth and speak, exactly what language is.